So, Christine, who are we canceling today?
Private equity, Kate.
Private equity. What the heck is that?
Well, it's the only equity that's left in the United States.
Because they got rid of DEI,
Correct.
diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity's gone, inclusion is gone, but equity, if it's private and it's involving money and late stage capitalism, we got it.
I don't know that I like this.
I don't like it either.
Hey everyone, I'm Caitlin Burns,
And I'm Christine Grimaldi,
and you're listening to Cancel Me Daddy,
the show where we take a closer look at all the panic around cancel culture
with thoughtful analysis
and verbal shitposting.
Christine, how are you doing today?
I'm having some deja vu, Kate.
You are?
Yeah, I was listening to the local NPR affiliate while driving, and I find myself just shouting, fuck you, whenever they do Trump segments. So it's really like 2016 Lord. Christine has come back. But I couldn't imagine how much worse it could be almost 10 years later.
You could be in my position and everyone you know could think you were a man.
Correct.
Yeah, like that was my February 2016.
Unbridled persecution.
Oh wait, that's what I am now. Oh fuck. According to the government anyway.
Yeah. Not a good time.
Well, how are you doing with the Trump administration besides screaming expletives?
You know, I mean, like, I am a cis white woman living in DC, so I'm pretty much okay besides the existential dread horror for myself. And then watching this happen to people, whether I know them or not, and then especially to friends, is really upsetting. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with DC's government. I don't know. Like, he keeps making threats about, I don't know, militarizing us or taking us over or taking away, like, our ability to self-govern here. So DC is one of the few places in the United States where you can get a later abortion. So people fly in, and also we have, local people, obviously. The trimester framework is bullshit. It was literally invented by Earl Warren. He's like, let me divide into three.
Former Supreme Court Justice.
Yes. Who fancied himself, I guess, a progressive, but shocking, was not. But this is both DC and Maryland are kind of havens for later abortion. And so I am very concerned that if there is some sort of fiat here, that's going to be the first thing to go, right? Like, I'm already worried about like a national abortion ban, but I think what might happen to DC first will obviously have a ripple effect across the whole country, because with so many clinics closed or unable to operate, that puts pressure on the remaining clinics.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how I might be trans and my government might be unpersoning me at the moment, but at least I don't live in DC and I still have the right to representation in Congress. So I got you there.
Listen, representation does really matter. Have they taken that away too with diversity and inclusion?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can still call and yell at some senators.
Yeah. That term you use, unpersoning, is really, it hit me hard.
Yeah, it's I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
It's been really difficult to work the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
On that happy note, we do have a really interesting show today, I think. We're talking to a journalist who has secretly done a lot to help me with my career over the years. A lot of people don't know this, but Megan Greenwell, who just wrote a fascinating book on private equity, which is now out for pre-order. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we'll have her on for a really interesting discussion about a threat to the country that I think a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah, and a threat that, predated this second term of Trump, but helped bolster, what's happening. And I think that it goes to the systemic changes that we needed to make even before Trump became president again.
And having said that, let's get into the interview. Joining us today is somebody who I have long admired, so I'm very excited about this. But Megan Greenwell, a longtime journalist who also wrote a book, Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream, which is out June 10th. So it's now available for pre-order. Megan, thank you for joining the show.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I'm so excited. I love your show.
I'm going to start us off because unlike Kate, I don't have a finance background. So I know that private equity is destroying America, among many other factors. I don't think I actually know the definition of private equity. So could you walk us through that?
Totally. I mean, not to do too much overt book promo here, but I'm not a finance person either. And so I really wrote this book for people who have some vague sense that private equity is a destructive force in our economy and really have no idea what that means, because that was literally me until private equity came into my own life. So the simplest way of summing up private equity is it's a system of finance that pools money from outside investors and huge bank loans to acquire companies through what they call leveraged buyouts. The leverage refers to the huge amounts of debt that they take on. Crucially, that debt is assigned not to the private equity firm that buys the company, but to the company that it is acquiring. So if I buy your company for $5 billion, $4 billion of that is loans, which is a pretty typical ratio. Your company is solely responsible for that $4 billion in loans, not my private equity firm that's worth many magnitudes more than $5 billion.
And it's very difficult for these companies to then overcome that debt load.
It's really difficult. Companies that get bought by private equity are often struggling in some type of way, right? In journalism, right? The business models have always been tricky and getting trickier. In retail, Amazon was sort of swallowing everything around the time that private equity was starting to get interested. But because of the debt, private equity firms really don't even have the option to do the long, slow, hard work of building the company's core business. Instead, the model is you have to keep taking out more and more loans. You have to keep cutting costs. And so the company is getting weaker and weaker. And meanwhile, it's very difficult for the private equity firm to actually lose money because they're earning their management fees regardless of whether the company is performing or not. So it ends up being a very good investment for the private equity firm. I think private equity people like to essentially say, we're taking out all this risk, so of course we shouldn't be responsible for the debt. But the reality is they're taking on very little risk at all. Even in the cases of catastrophic collapse, the private equity firms tend to make money. They'll make less money than they do in a successful exit, but they're doing fine.
Where does venture capitalism fit in with private equity? Is that like a subset of it? Because I met a bro once who was like, I'm in VC.
I met a bro once is so good.
Well, it was in DC, and we didn't really used to have a lot of venture capitalism here, and I've noticed this shift really in the past year or two, and leading us into the tech broligarchy that we live under right now. But that notwithstanding.
Yeah, no, they're everywhere now. So VC and private equity are frequently confused with each other. They're not the same. They do share a lot of overlap, and there are a lot of firms that do both. But classically, venture capital is an investment, right? So you're buying a proportion of the company in exchange for your investment. As the company's net worth grows, you make more and more money. There are a lot of problems with that. I would argue that it's far less problematic than the leveraged buyout form of private equity, where the private equity firm owns the company outright. So it's not an investment, it's actual ownership, and you're not on the hook in the same way. So in venture capital, if I invest in your business and your business goes under, I will lose my investment. In private equity, that's not usually the case because so much of it is loans that, again, the firm is not responsible for.
I wanted to ask Megan, and I know a little bit of the backstory here, observing as an outsider, but what you mentioned, you alluded to this earlier, where you said that you personally came into contact with private equity. So I'm interested in hearing just a little bit about that, and then how that then prompted you to want to write this book.
Yeah. So I was the editor in chief of a sports website called Deadspin,
It's a good
which
website.
Caitlin has. You wrote for Deadspin back in the
I
day,
never
right?
got to write for Deadspin.
Did you really?
No.
Wow.
So you probably remember I applied for a job there.
I do.
And I got to I think the second round of interviews, and I think you guys ended up hiring Kelsey McKinney, who's like a superstar. So I was like, I actually don't feel bad about not getting this job. But I don't think I ever ended up getting a byline there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, working at Deadspin was really my dream job. Like, I had covered sports before, but I didn't want to do traditional sports coverage. I had always loved Deadspin. This was really the job I wanted, the place I wanted to be.
Mhm.
About a year and a half into my tenure as editor in chief, the site was sold to a small Boston based private equity company called Great Hill Partners. At the time, I thought this was probably the best case scenario.
Mhm.
Some of the potential buyers of Deadspin, whose names were being bandied about, were very involved in media and companies that were well known for coming in and stripping media companies for parts. Great Hill Partners was not involved in media really, and they sort of had a reputation for owning a lot of trendy brands. So they own Bombas and they own Wayfair, kind of
Mhm.
cool millennial stuff. So it did not seem like the worst case scenario at first. That changed immediately. The very first morning that they owned the company, all of these guys in suits were walking around, and our new CEO asked me, "Why are you the right editor in chief for Deadspin?" And I was sort of like, Okay. And I said, well, I'm in the job, so that's one thing. And I've done a really good job in this job by any metric, right? So traffic has grown. The types of stories we do have diversified. We've gotten nominated for awards. It doesn't really matter which metric you prioritize.
Mhm.
We have succeeded under my leadership. And he shrugged and said, well, I guess we'll see, which was not a great sign. And
Yeah.
things really got worse from there. He really wanted to control what kinds of stories we could write about and what kinds of stories we could not, which was obviously super problematic on principle, but was also just completely inane because he wanted to cut stories that drove great traffic while simultaneously talking about how important it was to grow traffic. So it
Yeah.
was just very difficult to get anything coherent out of him. The upshot was I lasted about 3 months before quitting my job. I wrote on the way out the door a piece that really I wasn't expecting anything out of. I just was mad and wanted to publish something on the internet, but the
I
piece went
remember that
very
piece.
viral.
That's the way you leave a job like that.
The adults in the room, right? Is what it was
The
called.
adults in the room, yeah.
Yeah. So I actually thought of that piece recently because somebody on Blue Sky asked, what are the seminal pieces that define this age of America? And there was a bunch of pieces, and I was like, you have to include the adults in the room. And they're like,
Oh,
oh, of course, how could I forget? Yeah.
that's very kind of you. Yeah, that piece, I mean, I wrote it almost in a fugue state, I would say.
Yeah.
I was just so furious and honestly just heartbroken that I was losing this job that was the only job I had wanted. And it really changed my life. I mean, immediately my agent reached out to me and was like, this is a book. You need to write a book about this. And I resisted that at first because
Mhm.
I did not want to write a book about the media industry because I'm not sure enough people care about the media industry. And I am so not a memoir writer, right? Like this piece was very non-typical for what I do. Like I'm not a cultural critic. I am not a screed writer. And I say that loving to read that kind of piece. It's just not at all what I do. I am so much a reporter. And so I sat on it for a really long time, but I kept reading about how private equity works in other industries. And eventually I decided, okay, I think the version of this that is the right book for me and that nobody else had done yet is a narrative nonfiction look at how private equity affects other workers, affects communities, and is really not, except for a couple of paragraphs in the intro, is really not rooted in my own experience at all.
I remember that time period so clearly too because I was actually applying for a job at Jezebel at the time, and I was a finalist for that job.
Oh, God.
They ended up hiring nobody, which is
I'm sure
not as cool as losing out to like Kelsey McKinney. But I remember meeting like the British guy who was like kind of locally in charge.
Oh yeah, Paul. Yeah.
Paul, what a weird. Okay, I don't know
Very
if I should
strange
say anything.
person.
Very weird guy. And I spent like an hour and a half with him, and it was just
in person
in his office, yeah, in Times Square. And it was just the weirdest thing. And it was like my like 8th interview for this job. And I'm like, why is it taking... And it turns out it was probably great that nobody got that job.
Yeah. Yes, truly.
Yeah, because like Jezebel, like they closed down the site and then it was sold to, I think, Paste Magazine.
Yes.
And then I was also doing work a lot for Splinter at the time, who I think was also under that umbrella.
Yep.
And they closed down Splinter, which I was really upset about. And then how long after you left was it that the staff quit?
It was about, I left in August, everybody else left in October. So a couple months.
And then they went on to start Defector.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I know we're here to talk about like your book and private equity, but like how has it been for you watching them grow this successful publication out of the ashes of like the worst experience of your professional career?
I mean, it's the best. I'm just so proud of them. I did some work to help them get the site off the ground, and then for various reasons decided it wasn't the right thing for me to go over there full time. But they know that I am like, their biggest cheerleader. I'm just obsessed with them. I love everything they do. I love every person on that staff. One of the coolest things to me is like they've hired people. The core of the staff are all people who I worked with at Deadspin. Yeah. But since then, they've hired all of these fascinating people that didn't work at Deadspin that have pushed it in all of these like fascinating directions. So like Sabrina Imbler is just like, they're a genius. Like they are a genius. And I don't think they know a single thing about sports. And the site is so much richer for having them involved in it. And now Rachel Hampton is hosting Kelsey's old podcast, Normal Gossip, also just a genius, like a true genius. And so it's been really, really fun to watch them like sort of keep the core of this group together, but get to explore in all of these different ways that wouldn't necessarily have been possible when we were under a corporate umbrella, even pre-private equity, right? So yeah, I love it.
Yeah, they've asked me to pitch them video game stories, which I thought was really cool.
Nice.
Yeah, they're like, why don't you send us like all the stuff that is not on your regular beat? And I was like, hell yeah.
That rules. Somehow, I also just had my first byline for them, which is like, it was a bizarre, like little piece that I could not imagine anybody else publishing about why I love like small regional art museums.
Oh,
and
I
it
read
was
that. Yeah.
So fun to write. And I honestly, I don't think I could have published that anywhere else. And it's like funny on one level that it took me 4 years to publish at a site that like I helped get off the ground. But it was really gratifying to get to publish this piece with them.
Yeah. And then I think the last thing I'll say about Defector is they were helpful with for us. So this podcast is now affiliated with the Flytrap newsletter, and they
Yeah.
were very helpful in helping us. Like they had some really helpful tips on helping us get off the ground as well. So it's like a pay it forward thing.
Yes.
I think.
I love how they've like helped create this whole ecosystem. So like
Yeah.
Hellgate, which is one of my favorite publications, they say all the time that they're indebted to the Defector staff for helping them get started. You guys, 404 Media, on and on and on. It's just so cool to see this ecosystem of worker-owned media crop up.
Yeah. I actually want to come back to the worker-owned media thing, but first I want to get back to the private equity.
Yeah.
So, like, how you talked about how private equity works, but like, how is it destroying America specifically?
So it is so ingrained in so many aspects of our society that people truly don't realize. So I think a lot of people first believe themselves to have encountered private equity when it buys the company they work for. But in a lot of cases, that's almost certainly not how you first encountered private equity. So they're huge in hospitals now, for example. They own a growing number of municipal water systems and power plants. They are in the business of like privatizing roads and bridges. They are huge in like nursery schools now. So if you have kids, if you have parents or grandparents, they're really big in nursing homes. Their tentacles are really everywhere. In the conclusion to the book, I say, private equity is everybody's problem now. And I think that's really true. It started as a relatively niche thing that you wouldn't necessarily encounter in your ordinary life. And now it is so ingrained in everything. And because of the way it works, because private equity firms don't necessarily care if the entities they buy succeed or fail, there's the potential for so much destruction there, right? So if you drive a hospital out of business, it does not necessarily make a difference to your own bottom line if you're private equity. It makes a huge difference, obviously, to workers at that hospital, to patients of that hospital, to the entire infrastructure of the town where the hospital is based, because now you're losing high-paying jobs, you're losing a place for people to get care. Businesses have a much harder time recruiting if they can't say we have high-quality healthcare here. And so that's one example. Housing is another example where it's just horrifying how deeply private equity is now wound into all aspects of the housing market. So single family homes, apartment buildings, mobile homes, big in all of those things. In certain places, private equity and other institutional investors are single-handedly driving down the rates of Black home ownership. This has been a thing in Atlanta where private equity bought up all of the kind of like entry-level homes. And so if your American dream involved buying your first home, private equity was making it way harder to do that. And so there are all these ways in which private equity is making it more difficult for you to have the basic tent poles of a good life. So the book focuses on 4 industries with one main protagonist from each: retail, housing, hospitals, and media. And in all of those, I think the character stories really show how much destruction private equity brought to their lives, but also uses them as a witness for how much destruction it brought to the larger world in which they operate.
Yeah, these are people's livelihoods. It's also like life and death, right? It's basic needs. When you're talking about water and shelter being privatized and like just run ranshad.
Yeah. I have a friend named Brian Goldstone who has a book coming out about people who are homeless while simultaneously having full-time jobs, and it's based in Atlanta. And
Mm-hmm.
in at least a couple of the stories he talks about, the trigger point for them losing their housing was a private equity firm bought their apartment building and either raised the rent or evicted them or whatever. And then a thing I learned from his book's called There Is No Place for Us. People should absolutely read it. It comes out in March. The extended stay hotels that prey on people who have gotten kicked out of more stable housing situations are also really fertile ground for private equity, because in the early days of the pandemic, when hotel occupancy rates were like close to zero, occupancy rates at these extended stay hotels were still like 80-90%. And
Yeah.
so private equity saw that and was like, oh, great, there is money literally off of preying on the most vulnerable people in our society. Yeah, it's horrifying.
And how did you find the stories, the people that you talk to in the different industries? Like, it sounds like, as you described, this touches all aspects of American life. But how did you find those people that you wanted to illustrate this larger issue?
It was hard. It took so much work and so many months and so many failed attempts. I chose the industries I wanted to focus on first. So I knew I wanted to look at housing, retail, hospitals, and journalism. And then I just started going deeper and deeper down various rabbit holes, trying to find people who would talk about it. Facebook groups were super helpful to me.
Mm.
LinkedIn, like premium search for who used to work at X or Y company, was incredibly
Oh,
helpful.
you're
But it
good.
was also, I love stalking.
Yep.
But it was also just a lot of talking to people, and either they were not quite right or they weren't able or willing, for various reasons related to their own personal circumstances, to give me the level of detail that I was going to need for a project of this magnitude. So I ended up with four main characters. I talked to more than 300 people for the book. So
Wow.
it was a lot of, not all of those were potential characters, a lot of those were experts, etc. But I went through, I would say more than a dozen people for each to find each character. I got, the most dramatic moment of the reporting process, my dark night of the soul, was when somebody agreed to talk to me and for the housing section. She was great. She's a drag king in Indiana,
Mm.
and she had kept contemporaneous notes and recordings
Oh, wow.
of all of the key meetings. And I was like, great, you're perfect. And so I made plans to go out to meet her. And I was staying at like a very depressing strip mall chain motel in Indiana. And she just fully ghosted me.
Mm.
And I think, I can't blame her for that. She was in a super, super difficult position. And I think ultimately she just decided that she couldn't put it all on the line for my book, for which she wasn't going to personally benefit, right?
Right.
So I definitely don't blame people. And also, it was just so hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's also frustrating. It feels like a problem that's too big to handle as like one person going
Mm.
through the world. So like, I guess I have a two-part question here. Why is this practice legal? And secondly, like, what can people do about the tentacles, as you say?
Yeah. So the reason it's legal is because the private equity industry has spent a truly soul crushing amount of money to make sure it stays that way. When the election first happened, a bunch of people asked me, like, how much worse is the private equity scene going to get under a Trump presidency? And my answer, which I stand by, is it's not going to get that much worse, because Kamala Harris had no incentive to further regulate private equity either.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's hard to imagine in our current political scenario much appetite for regulating it in a serious way. 88% of people in Congress and the Senate receive some sort of private equity money, which is truly stunning, right? And on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right, Kate, that it is not a problem any of us individually or even like a ragtag group of us can effectively handle ourselves. It's going to have to be a very multifaceted approach. So there are good ideas for regulating it. Elizabeth Warren has proposed this Stop Wall Street Looting Act in the Senate 3-4 times now, and it's not getting anywhere, but like I would like to maintain some optimism that at some point our political circumstances will change and something like that will get through, and having people in Congress that are going to continue to push that even though they know it's not happening now gives me a little bit of hope, right? There is also a lot of movement on the state level. So Kate, you're in Massachusetts, right?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, there was this big blow up at the end of last year with this chain of hospitals called Steward Healthcare, which was this incredibly horrifying story of private equity malfeasance leading to the death of a ton of hospitals. And some really great Boston Globe reporting revealed the death of a lot of patients as well. As a result of that, Massachusetts has gone hard on saying, well, now we regulate private equity in healthcare. That is just like a core tenet of what we do as a government. And that can get through in Massachusetts, right? And there are other states where that kind of thing can get through. And I also think there's a lot of work that has to be done on the ground level. So reinventing industries, pushing court cases, all of these things that feel big and scary for normal people, but they don't get done unless normal people actually do them. So one thing I really take pains to emphasize in the book is that the problems of the industries I write about were not created by private equity, right? So if you take media as an example, like you can point to so many screw ups that media industry leaders did long before private equity came into the picture. And private equity took advantage of that. And now, talking about things like worker owned media, talking about things like, is there some form of government funding of media that does not compromise the media's independence, but gives them some additional resources so that they don't die? That kind of work has to fall on the rank and file people who have the incentive to make sure these industries continue to exist. So a journalist I really admire, Matt Pierce, recently left the LA Times, and he was working full-time at his media union job for a bit, and now he took a job at an advocacy organization that is trying to figure out government funding of media. There are all sorts of potential problems with government funding of media. That is not a silver bullet. But the fact that somebody like him, a great journalist, was willing to say like, okay, you know what? I am putting my money where my mouth is, and I am going into this because I want to figure out solutions, was really inspiring to me.
Yeah.
We talked about the worker-owned media model. Like, do you think that is a more viable route for journalists these days I realize this is diverting off of the private equity path a little bit, but not totally. But like organizing ourselves into media collectives, like we did the Fly Trap, like Defector did. Do you think that is sort of the way forward for journalists who want to keep doing journalism rather than watching our industry die?
I would say it's a part of it. I think it's too much to put the burden of saving the media industry on worker-owned media.
Okay.
And I don't mean it as a knock on any worker-owned media company to say that they are pretty small and not in a position to replace major institutional media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, that is not a critique. That I think in a lot of ways that's a great thing, because aiming for sustainability rather than aiming for world dominance is something so important, and is something you can do when you're a worker-owned collective rather than owned by a corporation. That said, I just don't think that can be the only solution.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think we need multiple approaches, right? I've done a bit of consulting work with the American Journalism Project, which is basically a foundation that pools money from other foundations and invests it in local news nonprofits. I am not super optimistic about the potential for worker collectives to succeed in the local media space, with the exception of something like Hellgate in New York City. But I think nonprofit digital startups do have a lot of potential, and some of
Mm-hmm.
those are doing such incredible work. I mean, Mississippi Today, which is one of my favorite local nonprofits out there, won a Pulitzer a year and a half ago or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is another component of it. I think figuring out some sort of government funding model might be another component of it. But I do, I definitely think I want worker-owned collectives to be a part of this, and I want there to be 100 parts of this. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. I do want to ask, because our show is like mainly focused on like internet stuff. I guess you could say internet culture. I mean, ostensibly cancel culture is the focus of the show, although we've very much broadened things since then. I'm wondering, like, what impact does private equity have on the more academic debates that we have about internet use, how the internet's evolving, or like free speech issues?
Yeah, that's such a good question. One thing I keep meaning to delve more fully into and haven't really yet is that private equity has growing influence in like the Silicon Valley tech space as well. And my sense is it plays out differently there, because it's like investing in companies that you're excited about, more like the VC model
Yeah.
than companies that like quote unquote need saving. But even aside from like pure tech and like social media companies, I think anytime a small handful of corporations is controlling a huge number of things, that does not bode well for our ability as normal people to speak freely, to have options for our platforms and our ways of expression, um, all of these things that like we value in how we use the internet and in how we operate in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this is not a specifically internet example, but one of the characters in my book was a tenant at a huge private equity owned apartment complex in Northern Virginia, and they threw her out of her apartment just because she was a pain in the ass.
Mm-hmm.
She was complaining about what they were doing and riling up her neighbors to stand up for themselves when conditions in their units were really, really bad. And they responded by saying, okay, then you cannot live here anymore. We will not renew your lease.
Wow.
Um, and so that is, though not an internet example, that feels to me a very representative example of what happens when these companies have power over the fundamental parts of our lives. Does that actually answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a question I have to ask.
Yeah,
It's like they want to see us siloed, right? And I think that's part of the reason, like, why we formed the Fly Trap. We wanted to have that newsroom experience. We all wanted to come together in a group, but there's just this like emphasis on individualization, if that's a word. And
yes.
if it's going to be like that, then we can't, then we have like nothing against private equity.
Yes. And private equity companies, have a strong interest, like you say, in making sure people stay siloed. One of the things I write about in the retail chapter is like owners of retail chains have made it very difficult for workers to find each other across different stores. And the reason for that is like, you don't want them to be able to unionize, right? You don't want them to be able to gather together and stand up against you. If you have them isolated in their individual stores, they're much less of a threat to you. Same with housing. Like there's this desire in many progressive circles for more tenant unions. And there are companies like Blackstone, a private equity firm, which is now the largest landlord in the country. But they're going to go to great lengths to make sure that tenants of one Blackstone building do not know how to find tenants of another Blackstone building.
Well, here's a question. Do the buildings know that they're Blackstone buildings? Do the people inside, what is the level of secrecy or obfuscation that private equity is employing in these scenarios?
Oh man, it is such a good question. The level of shell companies on shell companies on shell companies that private equity uses, shell companies all the way down, that private equity uses to obfuscate is incredible. I looked at apartment complexes and mobile home complexes where after months of digging into it, I truly could not figure out who the owner of this complex was.
Wow.
And, private in the name private equity refers to the money is coming from private sources. But it also really works as a description for how they operate. They love operating in secrecy. And so it can be very difficult to tell what company owns your employer, your landlord, whatever it is. And, almost every character in my book had the experience of not knowing who was ultimately in charge of the company they worked for. So there's one section in my book about Toys R Us, RIP, and this woman had worked for Toys R Us for like 5 years by the time everything fell apart with Toys R Us. And she didn't know which private equity firms were in charge of Toys R Us. Why would she? Like her paycheck said Toys R Us. Her bosses and her boss's bosses and on up for several levels all worked for Toys R Us. So it's a really helpful thing for private equity that nobody knows what they're up to.
You mentioned Toys R Us, and of course that was like an institution when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Like I loved going to Toys R Us. It was the best thing.
It's like elder millennial jam.
Yeah.
Right. And then I have an older daughter who's 15, and she vaguely remembers going to Toys R Us and like having sensory overload of all the toys. And then I have a third grader also, and she has no concept of what Toys R Us is, and it's absolutely wild to me. Like I could sit here with my kids and sing the Toys R Us song, and they'll look at me like I have 6 heads.
Oh yeah.
I'm a Toys R Us kid.
Yeah. Well, it went under in 2018, so like a third grader is not going to have any memory of that.
Not at all. And it's incredible to me that a behemoth like Toys R Us could just so easily fall apart. Like, how did that happen?
Man, that's exactly why I was so captivated by the Toys R Us story.
Yeah.
Because there's a term in business to describe retail companies called category killers, which means they are a single chain that is too big for any other company to compete with it, right? And the term category killers, which is now a staple in MBA curriculums, was invented to describe Toys R Us.
Wow.
That's who inspired that phrase. And so it was so big and so dominant that nobody else even really bothered entering that space in a serious way. And so the reasons for Toys R Us's demise, like I said, private equity never creates the problems from scratch. Toys R Us had made some colossally stupid business decisions. When internet retail was first becoming a thing, and everybody could tell that Amazon was going to come to dominate everything in the first half of the 2000s, Toys R Us decided to sign a deal with Amazon. So rather than creating their own online platform, they signed a deal with Amazon where they would become Amazon's exclusive toy supplier, and they would pay Amazon for every single toy they sold. Shockingly, this ended up proving a tremendous benefit to Amazon and just a tremendous albatross to Toys R Us. So
Good Lord.
everybody always sort of like, private equity didn't create Toys R Us's problems. Fully agree.
Yeah.
That said, when private equity came in, they loaded so much debt onto this company that there was no money to make the improvements they needed. So a group including KKR, Bain and Company, and Vornado Realty Trust bought Toys R Us in 2005. At that point, it wasn't too late to say, oh shit, we desperately need to create a real internet presence now. But they didn't, because they didn't have the money.
Right.
And the rank and file workers, like the one I profile in the book, were saying like, hey, like this store experience feels woefully out of date. Maybe we can't keep up with Amazon, but we at least need to keep up with like Target, Home Depot, like basic stores that continued to exist well into the Amazon era. There was just no money to do it. And so what ultimately drove Toys R Us out of business was not helped by the poor business decisions in their life before private equity, but was directly a result of having a truly crippling amount of debt.
You mentioned Bain and Company. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a certain Mitt Romney used to be president of Bain and Company. I remember that from the campaign.
Yes.
Former governor of my state. Good Lord.
Yes.
Fun fact, Mitt Romney is the only Republican I've ever voted for.
Fascinating.
It was in my first ever election when he was running for governor of Massachusetts. And I was like, I think it's a good idea to have the legislature be controlled by one party and the executive branch by the other. And boy, was that stupid.
We've all been there.
We've all been 18. Yeah. I think what scares me the most out of all of this is like, so I need some, for like, there's lack of a better term, like some crap, right? And will I order that crap on Amazon? I don't want to, because it's owned by a billionaire, but it's crap. Right. So it's like electrolyte powder packets, okay? Because we get sick here all the time. So it's not like something that really is going to be in a local business. It's going to be in either Amazon or a big box store. So like my spouse is going to Target later. Is Target owned by private equity, or in part or whole? I don't know. And I think it's just that feeling of feudalness that really upsets me. And I know that we are stronger than that, or at least I tell myself that. But what do we do with that feeling of, well, oh, I'm going to like take an action today by buying something from Target instead of Amazon, when it's really all shit?
Yeah, totally. My dear friend Liz Lenz, a brilliant writer, is still mad at me because several months ago she was like, we were texting and she was like, I'm going to Jimmy John's for my like little treat. And I was like, LOL, don't go to Jimmy John's, they're private equity owned. And she was like, why are you ruining this little thing that brings me so much joy, right? She still brings it up like weekly with me. So yes, it is a real problem, and I'm not convinced that simply don't buy from stores that touch private equity is a particularly effective solution, I would say. Because like, right, there are like all sorts of ethical reasons to boycott Target right now, right? But at a certain point, you need your electrolyte powder, right? And who is going to sell you your electrical light powder in an ethical way?
There's also this accessibility issue too, right? Because a lot of people who are low income or have disabilities, like they rely on those kind of stores and services and delivery, even though like it's overall horrible. But like what else service is like going to come in there and pick up like that accessibility slack?
Yeah. No, I think this is such a problem. There is no incentive, in part because of the world private equity has created, for anybody to make a go of it in a serious way in so many of these industries, whether it's retail, whether it's hospitals, etc. We have a much deeper societal problem. And so that's why, like, the individual choices of, do you buy your electrolyte powder at Target or Amazon, or do you like find some bougie local option for it, is like, I think in a lot of ways the wrong question. And I like do get frustrated by people who put too much onus at the individual consumption level, because just realistically that is not the level on which we are going to change these things, right? So what do we do with those feelings? I think what we have to do with those feelings is work toward broader systemic change, doing all those things from lobbying for legislation to uh, raising awareness, whatever that means, to reinventing industries, etc. That is much harder work, and the payoff may not come until after all three of us are gone, right? But I think that's the only work that will actually make the difference here.
Yeah. I strangely feel the same about trans rights right now. So I get you. The change will come after I'm gone.
God, yeah.
Well, Megan, this has been great. Where can our listeners keep up with your work?
Oh, geez. I rant a lot about private equity on Blue Sky. My handle is just my last name, Greenwell. I post really stupid memes about private equity that entertain me and maybe three other people on Instagram, where my handle is ME Greenwell. And most importantly, I would love for anybody to pre-order my book, which comes out June 10th. I'm trying to show that there is a real appetite to talk about these issues. And so the pre-orders mean a whole lot to me.
Yes, we will have a link for that in the show notes. I also believe we have an affiliate relationship with Bookshop. So
Beautiful.
we'll have our Bookshop link for the fly trap there for that.
Love it.
For all of our listeners. Yeah. But thank you for coming on. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both. This has been so fun.
All right, Christine, what do you got for your Buzzmom corner?
Oh, I got another tech broligarch, Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post. He has.
What did he do this time?
Oh, what did he do this time? He said that the opinion pages of the Washington Post would now advocate for, quote, personal liberties and free markets, unquote. I believe that was in an email to his newsroom, because you know, he owns it, and that the current opinion editor of the Post will be leaving. This sounded like such a tech broligarch thing, because I think I remember reading in a little excerpt, he said to the opinion editor, if it's not a like hell yes, if you want to stay, then it's a no. And it's like, what? So we have to like be complicit in our own demise? We have to like cheer our own demise? It sounded like the most Silicon Valley thing that has ever come to DC.
My first reaction to that is, doesn't the Wall Street Journal already have that as their opinion page remit?
I believe so.
And second of all, what personal liberty? Like, whose personal liberty? Do they mean trans people's personal liberty? Because that's one thing. You
know, that was the first thing I thought about when I read that. Like, personal liberty, like you let us be who we are authentically
Yeah.
and have bodily autonomy.
Does the free market include the freedom to organize a union, Mr. Bezos?
Oh, free market. Yeah, that sounds good.
Does the free market apply to the labor market or no?
Oh, not to his company
No,
or companies.
we already know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I am concerned about where democracy is going. Well, they already got rid of that tagline, right? Democracy dies in darkness. I think that happened earlier this year.
I don't think it was a tagline as much as a mission statement at this point.
Yeah, well, the darkness has descended.
I reluctantly do not have a second Washington Post subscription to cancel, so...
Oh, I have to go cancel ours. Yeah. I was going to say, what's going to be left to read? I was like, how about worker-owned media?
How about the Fly Trap?
How about the Fly Trap? Yep.
Yeah, it's grim times.
Yeah. I feel for all of the reporters who are there. I mean, like, I've lived in DC a long time. You lived here for quite a bit of time. And I think we both have met really dedicated reporters at the Washington Post.
Yeah. I happen to think that their reporter that works on the trans beat for them is actually really good.
Yeah.
And even though she's not trans, I think she does really good work. So,
who is that?
Her name's Casey Parks.
I don't know her. I don't know her reporting, so I'll have to check it out.
She actually centers trans people in trans-related stories, which is, more than I can say about a certain competitor further north. I will say about the Washington Post, there was a story today about trans women who were turning to gun ownership in the time of Trump. Have you seen this story?
No.
I'm going to text it to you.
Okay.
And I want you to tell me if this is the hottest that anyone has ever looked in a newspaper.
Oh, fantastic. That is the hottest that anyone has ever. I'm sorry I'm sorry to objectify you, but you are hot. And that pose is just like, wow.
Yeah, I'm like, holy shit, what the aura of this. Also, the fact that she doesn't have her finger on the trigger of the gun, I really like that.
Yeah.
Because that shows gun discipline, which you never get from conservatives. They're always putting their finger on the triggers if they're about to blow something away.
Bad with guns, like responsibility.
They're NPCs.
Yeah. They're what?
They're NPCs.
What is that?
You've never heard of an NPC?
No.
So it's a video game term for non-playable character. So like if you're doing a quest in a game and you come upon like a villager who like you can interact with and there's like a conversation tree that happens off of it, that's an NPC.
Oh, interesting.
And the insult is like you're not a main character.
Well, I think that describes the state of the Republicans, the conservatives.
They always call liberals NPCs, but I'm reclaiming it.
I think you should.
And I'm flipping it back on them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A journalist that I knew coming up, Marian Kogan. I've referenced her before on the podcast, because she wrote that article, House of Cads, about female journalists actually being the subject of sexual harassment by members of Congress, not the other way around. I just remember years ago, she also wrote a piece about like liberal gun ownership.
Yeah.
Because she came from a part of Pennsylvania where the politics, I think, were more progressive, if I'm recalling correctly, but also like gun ownership tended to be high. I don't know if that was like a hunting thing or whatever.
Probably.
Yeah. So when you said to me like, oh, there's this article about trans gun ownership in the Post, like it didn't surprise me that might be happening right now.
I've talked with my family about possibly getting a gun for personal protection here. But ultimately I decided not to because I have a very fearless third grader for a daughter who I just want to take an extra precaution and not have it in the house at all.
Yeah. Well, this is why I took up boxing last year. So yes, your ombudsman boxes.
I have different forms of protection in case some asshole is listening and God, fantasizing about breaking in or whatever.
No, please don't. Yeah, keep out.
Wow, we had a really uplifting episode today.
Yeah, what can we what can we leave the people with?
Support our Patreon.
Yes. Well, supporting our Patreon gets us, allows us to make more episodes, and hopefully these episodes are a source of information, entertainment. It's kind of like a little light right now, even when they're on heavier topics.
We're also really close to, I think we're kind of at the break-even point with our expenses on this show versus what we take in, which is really, really great. So
does that mean we're no longer losing money, Kate?
I think we're no longer losing money. But it also means that we're uncompensated for the work that we do now.
Please compensate.
So if you do like the show, I can't stress enough, Patreon is the way to go. We have a fun little Discord community that you can join by becoming a $5 member. You can get early access to our episodes at the $10 level. And we're going to be actually making some public posts for... we got chosen as part of a Patreon pilot program, which I'm not going to go into details about here, but you're going to see public posts from us on our Patreon going forward. So don't be alarmed if you see that as well. And also, if you are interested in becoming a sponsor of Cancel Me Daddy, we encourage you to contact sponsors at multitude.productions. Cancel Me Daddy is a Flytrap Media production, and today's show is made by me, Caitlin Burns, my incredible co-host Christine Grimaldi, and our amazing editor Maria Paleologos.
Dee Peterschmidt made our theme song, and Romy Tirico designed our graphics. Ads by Multitude Productions.
Our show is made possible by the incredible cancelers supporting our work, especially the member of our Canceler Hall of Fame, with the great power to cancel all of their enemies, Meg.
We appreciate your support.
Happy canceling!